This is Something to Talk About from the Bainbridge Island Senior Community Center. And today we're going to unpack queer alphabet, LGBTQ++, figure out what the letters mean and any other questions you might have. Ann Lovejoy will be with us. I want to start by thanking Fieldstone Communities of Bainbridge Island, which underwrites our programs on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. They offer memory care, and they're about to offer assisted and independent living up on Rolling Bay. To learn more about that, to take a tour, or to learn about day stay and respite programs, call 360-689-4314. Also, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathering on the ancestral homeland of the Suquamish people, the people of the clear salt water, who have lived on the Salish Sea since time immemorial. We honor them and are grateful for their hospitality and their stewardship of these lands. And thank you very much for joining us for another great idea, I guess I could say. Inclusion, diversity, equity, and what's
the A can be for ally, it can be for access, it can be for annoying, it can be for so many things. So we leave that one kind of open, right?
Okay.
So thanks everybody for showing up. What we're going to talk about today is the alphabet, and also what that really is. I think for a lot of people, the questions are, what do all those letters mean? But a lot of times what they're really asking is, what are the experiences behind those letters? What do people who identify with various letters actually live into? How does that work? The queer alphabet has changed a lot in recent years, expanded enormously as everybody who has a new idea sticks on another few letters just to make sure every possible base is covered. But I think one of the things that's interesting and important to remember is that we talk about people being on various spectrums, and that the gender spectrum is among those, and that all spectrums are basically bell curved in one way or another, but some of them have a pretty steep curve, some of them have a very gentle curve. But the really fascinating fact is every single one of us is on every single one of those spectra somewhere. We may be smack in the middle, we may be at some far, far end where we show very little, if any, of the traits of that particular spectrum, but we're there. And as one of my dear friends often says, there's a little queer in all of us. And I think that piece has been explored pretty thoroughly in recent years by many, many people. One of the interesting, really interesting things that I've discovered as I've been nurturing a group called Transfriending, a family support group, is that there are people as young as 3 who very, very clearly identify as a gender other than the one they were identified with at birth and continue to do so for years. And there are people who, like my own daughter, came out at 35, which was a bit of a surprise for me. But as she said, you don't know what you don't know, and you learn it as you go. There are people I know who have come out in their 80s and even in their 90s. So part of it is this lifelong exploration of who we really are in the world. And one thing that's really great about, for one thing, living in Washington, where there's a lot of protections for people who are in gender exploration or in gender transition, but it's also a place where, and a time and place where exploration is being more accepted sometimes. And in some places, we're lucky that this is one of the times and one of the places, because I'm seeing a lot of pioneering thought going on with all ages, where people, kids especially, maybe are really looking into who I am in the world and what I might be apart from cultural and societal norms or expectations. So I wanted to kind of open that up and invite comments and questions from any of you, but maybe start off too with Eve, would you like to give a little bit of your advice or information about this whole string of letters?
Oh, goodness. I think that my advice is that this always changes. You know, when we say that, you know, A means this, or, you know, this, you know, Q means that, tomorrow it'll be, you know, it'll be more to it. You know, it goes on forever. And that's one of the reasons that a good number of people are just using the word queer or say queer and trans to, be inclusive enough, because the definitions that people are using are so finely paired in these days that it's really hard not to say, well, okay, we'll just include all of your names, because we are all on this spectrum someplace or another. And so I have a distinct memory of my friend Simon, who's a trans guy. And notice I use the word trans guy because some trans guys say they are trans masculine, some trans guys say there's trans men, and it just goes on that way. And the first time I heard him say that he was trans masculine, I had never heard the term before. And I said, does that mean I'm trans feminine? And I don't like that term. That's not how I would describe myself. So just keep in mind that these are all approximations, and they're really there to help us see the infinite variety that there is among us all.
I've heard you use the phrase the queerbrella.
No, I always use the phrase the transbrella, because the gender umbrella seems to be a much wider kind of thing, because it covers so many people who are agender, non-binary, all the different words. I can't even think of them all right now. There's one I'm trying to reach in my head, but I cannot find it. They're just so different. It's like the Australian comedian Hannah Gadsby, who was always very careful to define herself as a lesbian, and that was it. Now uses seems to be going towards a they kind of persona. Describes herself as agender of some sort or another. It's just really kind of strange, but she plays with that a lot.
I think there's a lot more freedom for that these days. I actually have a friend who's not even had the child yet. The child is coming in August, right? Will be born in August. And already the mom is saying, I think I'm going to use they, them, so that they have lots of opportunity to explore who they are.
And wonderful. It's language changes all the time. And they, them is very difficult for people. And my fallback right now is to say, yeah, I know any change in the language is really, really difficult. And I know you cannot possibly do this except that you're of my age and you remember how much trouble people had using the word Ms. And yet that came into being, and that you don't even think about it anymore.
I had another thought about that the other day when somebody said, I just can't get used to it. I thought, we were in a Zoom and somebody said, oh, you're muted. And I thought, when was the first time we all used that phrase?
It was in 2018, whenever
2020, for
2020.
sure. But it's already become part of our vocabulary, right?
Oh,
because
yeah.
we use it a lot. But part of the thing is, if we don't use it a lot, some of these letters or concepts still feel foreign because they're awkward. Now, the good news about they, them is that when you're talking to someone, you never have to use it. You say, hello, someone, how are you, right? You don't have to say, how are they to them. But when you're trying to refer to them to somebody else, that's when it can get a little awkward. But it's just practice as much as anything. And I think one of the pieces is we don't want to make a mistake. We don't want to say the wrong thing. But the good news, in my experience anyway, is that pretty much everyone I know is very forgiving if they sense your goodwill. If you make a mistake, you step in it and you say the wrong thing, and then you probably go, oh, darn, that's not the right term or phrase or word or name. Most people will say, that's okay, just keep trying, keep practicing.
Yeah, and it's not even that we're just really aware of people's goodwill. What we're really aware is of the absence of ill will. We'll pick up on something that's either indifferent or actually hostile. You know, we may correct people when they're, you know, just making a mistake, but we usually will say, you know, there you are. You know, it takes a while. You should, you know, I mean, I always tell people when I'm mediating, you know, your mediator, you know, one of your mediators today is trans. I use she and her, but it's no big deal if you get this wrong. The only person who's got to get this right is my co-mediator. And I've seen, and I said, and I'll mark him down if he gets it wrong. And in one mediation, this happened, and you know, he messed up a time or so, and the parties, you know, made little marks on their, you know, pads. You know, they were marking him down.
Poor Marcus. That's funny.
No, it wasn't Marcus. It was not Marcus. No, it was one of our Johns.
Oh, cool.
Which
So
sounds wrong by itself. And I do need to say, just because, you know, to honor our absent friend today, you know, Lynn, as she said last time at Transfriending, hi, my name is Lynn, and my pronouns are me and I and me.
Great. I love that. I wondered, Whitney, do you want to speak a little bit?
Sure. I'm staring off into space.
I know there are some.
So you just like whatever is at the top of my head or anything specific?
I'm thinking about how like a lot of people are pretty familiar with the lesbian, gay, bisexual, or sort of whatever, right? But some of the other ones like aromantic or asexual are much less familiar, and that can be it can be difficult for people to get their head around, and it can be really annoying to have people say, well, are you sure? Maybe you just haven't met the right person or something along those lines.
Yeah. So anyways, for those who don't know me, my name is Whitney, and I realized about 2.5 years ago that I'm asexual. I had heard the term before pathologically, not as a, you know, sexual orientation, and was what felt like to me accused of being asexual by various therapists and my ex-husband. And you know, it was never a neutral thing. It was never just like, yeah, you know, it's cloudy today or whatever kind of thing. So I was standing in my kitchen one day and I suddenly was just like, I wonder if I'm asexual, not knowing anything about it other than pathologically hearing the term, not, you know, knowing about it as a sexual orientation, and started doing a lot of research. And I literally, at the risk of sounding a little woo-woo, I like felt my chi line up. I just felt like taller and like in my body, and really in a lot of ways for the first time in my life. And so the baseline as to what asexuality is not experiencing sexual attraction. And the best way I can describe it is that I read in a book, but I had my own experience of it is, and so I'll just share my own experience, is when I was, I don't know, 16, oops, you all went away. Nope, you all came back. That was weird. Like all went away, all came back. Anyway, so when I was 16, my sister was 13. My sister was kind of prudish, and you know, and there was sort of one time she was like, oh, he's so hot. He's so hot. And this guy was wearing a coat. And I'm like thinking, why didn't he just take his coat off if he's hot? And, you know, at the same time, I knew that it didn't mean a temperature thing. I mean, I suppose it does in a sense, but not, you know, not in that kind of, you know, wearing a coat or not sense. And, you know, so I just kind of like, you know, kind of looked around to see if I could get any clues or cues from the other people who were there and who were all agreeing with her. And I think my parents were even there and they were agreeing. And I'm like, you know, and I also have ADD, and so I often miss social cues and not quite understand what's going on. Anyways, but I read that in a book of about asexuality. A person had a similar experience, although he knew what was going on more than I did. So yeah, and I read in another book, there's now more and more books about asexuality. I don't think I have it here on my table. One called Ace. I can't remember the author. So Ace is a nickname for asexuality. Anyways, that one's fairly academic, but it also has it's pretty readable. It's probably more than I wanted to know, and I'm Ace, so guessing more than most other people would want to know. Oh, thanks, Reed. Yeah, so and I think the thing that's hardest for me right now is that I have to, well, I don't have to, but I'm given a lot of opportunities to educate. And it's just, I know that, even still present tense in some situations, but, as you were saying, and that most people, are aware enough of the terms gay and lesbian and now more so trans, than historically, and bisexual. And I would say probably most people know of somebody who's, gay or lesbian, and probably these days, maybe even trans. And kind of, I've heard of straight people sort of proudly, my friend, so-and-so, it's sort of like their gay friend, as if it's, a exotic animal at the zoo or something like that. And, it's said proudly and affectionately, but I have to sort of stifle a chuckle when people do that. And, but whereas with asexuality, it's not understood, it's statistically, it's considered somewhere between 1% and 7% of the population. It's, so most people experience sexual attraction, and it really is the broad norm. And so, to not have that experience, is people want to understand. I do find that people want to understand, which is nice, but it's hard to understand. And anyways, and I just have to remind myself, it's like, I know, and it's, that's the most important thing. So
I think you're right that there's very little understanding, but even like asexuality is also on the spectrum. I mean, I'm also something called aromantic. And growing up, I always wondered, like, we'd go to the movies or something and it'd be these really disgusting giant people kissing. And I just go, ugh, ugh, ugh. And other people would be like, ooh, and I think, what is wrong with me? I think that's so gross. Or it's like, but there's a spectrum of all those things. You might have a sexual attraction to someone you know well and trust, but not to anybody else, for instance. But it isn't, you wouldn't have the kind of teen crush of somebody you don't know kind of thing, maybe. So that there's degrees of all these things. But yeah, some of these lesser known categories or situations or orientations, if you will, are the ones that are maybe the most misunderstood. And I think that exploration, I'm looking at so many young people who are saying they're gender curious, gender questioning, gender exploring. And that just feels like such wonderful freedom to me. Rick, did you want to add anything to all this?
Unmute. Now, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm just sitting here thinking about how does this apply to me, because I'm definitely on the spectrum in some respects. You know, there's variations of the spectrum. And while I identify as gay and male, in a bodily function, in an attraction sense, I'm only attracted to males if I'm attracted. I find beauty in all forms, but I'm only attracted to males from an affectional or relational sense, and the sense of romantic relationship. But I'm not strongly attracted to that. And I'd have to say, on one level, I feel more hermaphrodite. I feel like a male and female, and but I don't have a desire to change parts. I wouldn't consider myself trans, wanting to become something else. If that's one way to look at trans, I don't know. So I'm just somewhere out there on the spectrum. I'd say, as far as attraction on a Kinsey scale, he would have labeled me probably a 6. On his scale was 0 to 6, and he would have labeled me a 6 in terms of homosexual attraction, meaning identify as a physical body of a male, and I'm attracted to male. So that's where I would sit. But I more used to think that it was rigid, that probably experiences.
Oh, Rick, you're breaking up a little bit. I'm not sure why.
It's probably the internet.
Maybe we'll come back to you. Mike, if do you want to step in a little here? Let Rick get his internet back.
Sure. I just think it's wonderful that there are so many options now, because when I was thinking about how narrow my little world was when I was born in 1952, and there were 2 options, it seemed to me. You could be male or you could be female. And heterosexuality was the norm, right? And it's wonderful now to hear people talk, like Whitney and stuff, about her situation, her feelings, and to feel like that's just part of this wonderful broad palette that we all have, that we can fit into in what place feels good to us. I think even in little things like when I was a kid, I almost never saw any Black people on television. And I remember when I suddenly started to see Black people just in normal everyday commercials and things like that, and it always had an impact on me. And then I remember how my ears would perk up when a man would say, refer to his husband, or a woman would refer to his wife. So those are all things that have expanded in my lifetime, and for which I'm grateful. I identify as a gay man, a gray man too. But I began the process of coming out about 3 years ago. And so to me, it's been just a big relief to be able to heave a sigh of a deep sigh and feel like I'm okay after all these years of trying to hide or trying to fit what I thought the society's agenda was.
Yeah, I think for a lot of people who feel like they're a misfit or there's a miscue, we're sort of learning a lot more about the possibilities and finding that there certainly are places we can be comfortably identified, or whatever you want to say, and that can take a while to settle into. As Whitney noticed, that sometimes we have to kind of grow into our own identities too. And the freedom to explore, like I said, that's really fairly new. I do know a few people who are Native American Two-Spirit people who have been able to feel like they had the backing, a tribal backing for that orientation, that there's a respect and an understanding, and that in most tribes anyway, Two-Spirits people are not considered male or female, but they're not really considered bi either. It's their own separate thing. And I think about that support and freedom being thousands of years old for some people. And then for others have it be really, it's such a new concept for so many people that it's harder to find a place of comfort with it. I know when my daughter came out to me, I didn't have a clue what transgender was about. And of course, immediately stepped all over it by saying, "Oh, so does that mean you're a gay girl now?" And she's like, "Mom, really? Like sex and gender have nothing to do with each other." I'm like, "They don't?" Like, I didn't ever have to know that. And I didn't know that. And it took me all these years, like 7 years, to kind of learn a lot more about this path and learn a lot more about the options and the possibilities. And one of the other things that I've learned quite a bit about from knowing a number of people who are intersex is that intersex is medically recognized. There are about 35 or 6 conditions considered under the intersex umbrella where people are born physiologically ambivalent, you might say, and that sometimes the determination of which gender they're going to be called or identified with at birth is up to whoever births them, the doctor, the nurse, maybe the parent. But often in the old past, it wasn't the parent at all. It was the doctors who were like, "Well, this looks more like a guy, so it's a boy." And then a lot of people grow up kind of confused because their own bodies are not telling them that they have a solid identification with the gender they're assigned at birth. And that one is tough to explain too, those ones, because there, like I said, there's quite a few shades of intersexuality and what that presents like and looks like. So there's more space in our culture today for people who are not as easily binary identified, which I think is just a huge blessing myself. I'm going to invite people to either raise your hand and ask a question or put questions in the chat if there's anything you've been really wondering about, curious about. And while you're doing that, maybe I'll see if Rick has his internet back.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, very well. Thank you.
I changed routers, so we'll see if this holds up. Just raise your hand if it doesn't, and I'll stop. I don't know that I had a whole lot more to say. I have been reading more about the intersex things and been hearing about hidden organs that people have in their bodies. And I wonder about myself at times. Do I have things that make me feel like this? And I don't know. It's I've heard of extra genes that you can have, or extra Y chromosome or something like that. And that will create the internal experience of the intersex nature, and but not have won't create the visible signs of that. So it's a strange place to be. The more I live, though, the more I look at other areas in my life where I've tried to stay in the closet. Will I be accepted socially if people know this about me or that about me? And the longer I live, the more authentic I find myself, stretching myself into the world. And since last fall, that's been my attention and my goal, to be much more authentic, because closer I get to whatever the end of this life is and the beginning of the next, I got less to lose. So, and I got a whole lot more to gain by being authentic. So call me whatever you want. Rick is my name, but you can start with that and we can go from there.
Thank you, Rick. Mike likes that too.
Sheila?
Yeah, I have a question. The word is inner or intersex? INTER or INNER?
INTR, inter, like intersectionality, interconnection.
Interconnection. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh. So Reed says, echoing Whitney, it sounds like the queer alphabet is about moving from pathology to diversity. And I think that's exactly right, that as we gain experience and understanding, a lot of things that were considered pathological, and for many of us growing up, are no longer considered that, at least by quite a lot of younger people. And I really had that experience that for the most part, when I'm working with people of different ages, anyone under the age of about 40 is so much more open and relaxed and comfortable with the idea that there's a lot of gender diversity, there's a lot of sexual diversity, there's a lot of emotional social diversity, and all those things can be quite comfortable. Whereas people who are over that age, it really depends on their life experience, their background, maybe their education level, their comfort with new ideas, and that we maybe see less of that acceptance from older people. And that's one of the reasons I really want to keep having this kind of conversation at the senior center, because I feel like, as Rick was saying, this is a time when we get to expand and we get to learn more about ourselves and each other, and to really enjoy the richness of that great diversity and that expansive experience, I guess I'd like to say.
Wonder along the lines of the pathology to diversity spectrum, if anybody here has awareness or can speak at all to the idea of the therapeutic community having a shift as well towards recognizing that there's just a lot of variety in humanity, and what might have been a treated condition now can just be a celebrated characteristic.
Oh, definitely, that's true. I mean, the American Medical Association has, for about 20 years, actually been coming out with studies and papers and position papers, more and more and more, showing that, for instance, for any child, but for children who understand themselves to be transgender, that it's much healthier for the family, for that person, to be able to identify that way and to be supported in that identification, and that depriving those kids of the opportunity to be the self they know themselves to be is really harmful. That's very well understood and documented by much of the medical community. Like everything else, guess what? There's a spectrum in the medical community too. And so you will find doctors who agree and doctors who disagree. But as far as the official position, that is that gender exploration is positive, that understanding where you sit on that gender spectrum is very helpful to develop a full healthy persona, a full healthy personality and character, and for a healthier life. We know that the suicide statistics are extremely high for instance, trans youth who are not supported by family or friends. It's as high as 40%, which is just appalling. So changing that up, providing the supports, putting the supports in place is really important. And I don't know if any of you have noticed that pretty recently, Minnesota has come out as a trans-friendly state and made really big statements about, like, come to us. If you're living in a state where you're not supported and you're in danger, move here, we'll take care of you, which I thought was amazing. And here in Washington state, of course, we have extremely effective and strong protections in place, thanks to, in large part, Jay Inslee, who's been a very strong proponent of well-being and mental and emotional, physical health for everybody, which is great.
When Mike was talking earlier about trying to fit into societal norms, I was thinking, you don't want to be someone with a pathology. And as long as that's sort of the square you have to be put into, no, I don't want to go there. I can see why that would sort of make it difficult to identify yourself as yourself.
And for some people, though, that what Rick was talking about, learning more and more about sort of the inner brain structures, some of the hormonal effects and shifts that happen in everybody, that can be part of shifting your own perception of who you are in the world. Some people can feel like well, that's a mistake, or that's a wrongness, or that's not normal, and start to feel like, I don't want to be, exactly, I don't want to be identified as someone who is experiencing pathology. I want to claim this as a normal, accepted part of the human experience. And that just means we have to make the human experience a little wider, or we don't have to make it wider. We have to acknowledge it as being wider, broader, more diverse than our narrow way. You know, it is a lot to do with, let's go back, white colonial culture that really narrowed things down. But not only that, there are also many ancient other cultures that the cultures of the book tend to be on the narrower side. And that has been a real problem around the world, because there are countries where nobody is safe if they are outside the social norms in almost any way. So education is huge. And that's part of, I think, our goal as Queer Elder Family Group, is to make sure that people are safe, that they have access to information, that families who are landing in a situation where they suddenly say, wait, my kid is what? I don't even know what that means. How do I support that? Should I support that? Am I wrong to support that? They need a soft landing. They need to have someone who can sort of say, yeah, these things are all part of the normal experience. Here's some help. Here's some great resources. And I'm so grateful that here in Washington, we really do have a lot of great resources. And here in Bainbridge, we have a lot of great resources, which is awesome too.
I just wanted to speak to the pathology aspect. I was married to a man for 32 years. I adored him. He was my best friend. You know, I wasn't sexually attracted to him. I didn't know that. You know, I was a kid of the 70s, and you know, grew up in the Bay Area and liberal household, and you know, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And you know, and you basically just had sex with, you know, usually, I mean, there was, you know, I mean, there definitely was gay and lesbian, but you know, the crowds I was with, it was basically you had sex with whoever was of the opposite sex that was nearest to one. And you know, it's like, it never even occurred to me, you know, the whole sexual attraction piece. And I, for years, we went to counselors, and, you know, and it was always Whitney's sex problem. Whitney was defective. Whitney needed to be fixed. You know, what could be done to fix Whitney? And I took that on. I really took that on, you know, that, and I tried, you know, I just tried and tried and tried and tried. And, you know, and I know, you know, I hear a similar story from a lot of usually gay men, some lesbian women also, who, you know, really tried to be, you know, in a partnership with their opposite sex, or, you know, male, female, opposite sex partner, and just that feeling defective sort of thing. One piece adjacent to that for me, being asexual and relatively aromantic as well, I find that that I'm very much an intense friend, and I've often had people misinterpret my overtures as friendship, what to me is friendship, as a romantic and sometimes sexual, often sexual interest in them. You know, I had many men who, you know, who, forgive the term, but, you know, accused me of being a cock teaser, and just like, what? How did we get here? You know, being just baffled by the whole situation. So, anyways, I just wanted to chime those bits in.
Yeah, the idea that there's something wrong that needs to be fixed, I think, is one of the most harmful ones we can use against each other in especially, I think that in the lesser understood categories, if you will, that there's right now a great deal of national pushback against trans children, especially, but trans people of all ages more than ever. And that the idea that parents are indulging in child abuse by supporting their kids in gender transition, in gender acknowledgement, is really one of those like firestorms right now. And I think it's a way to sort of distract people from bigger issues, bigger economic and social issues. But it's also extremely painful and difficult and dangerous to have trans youth exposed to that kind of confusing, conflicting, and really mean-spirited a lot of times attitudes. So one thing we can do, especially as elders and queer elders or straight elders, is help young people understand that there is path, that there are people. I remember we did a program with some of the high school kids a couple of years ago at BEMA, and one of them was sort of adorable, said, "Oh, I never imagined being an old queer person." Right? And you're like, yeah, it actually happens.
The whole imagining being old is one that we're all getting used to.
To be a
And
role
I
model,
mean, I'm, like, I'm with Mike. I identify as gray for sure.
right? That we can stand up and say, look, there's a path, there's people, there's help. We have stories to share. And anybody who's interested, you can look back, and we've actually recorded some stories, some really moving and powerful stories from some people here. And actually Queer Elders have a project of capturing some of these stories. Mike, you're kind of involved in that, aren't you?
Yes, I am. We're on a little bit of a hiatus right now, but we're going to be moving forward on that. There's just some really rich, wonderful stories that people have to tell about their lives and the challenges that they've faced and how they've overcome them. And it's really inspiring. I want to get that recorded so that that's available going forward.
I think that's really important because we need stories that we can find ourselves in. And for young people, for kids, I mean, how many of you remember growing up reading a bunch of stories and thinking, uh-oh, none of these fit me? Or, I'm appalled sometimes when I look back at books that I loved as a child and read to my kids, and I come to read them to my grandkids, and I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe that I didn't notice this, that, or the other about those wonderful, beloved books. My daughter-in-law actually has redone some things like the Babar books, and she'll write out new dialogue and paste it in the book over the old. It's like the illustrations are fabulous, the story's great, but let's change up quite a few things here. And that's kind of a neat way to take it, but we can do that kind of in another way in our own stories. It's like telling a story so that someone else knows there's a path, telling our story so someone else knows there's a way to get through, and that there is I know our friend Lynn, who's not here today, always says, I want people to know there's a good side. I want people to know there's positive things about being trans and that it isn't all terrifying and horrible. That's important too.
I remember when I was reading the book Slaughterhouse-5. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's to give you a super short idea of the script. It involves somebody who's been abducted by space aliens to the planet Tralfamadore. And at one point, the Tralfamadorians, who have been studying humankind for a long time, reveal to him that in order for human beings to reproduce, you need a whole spectrum, like 7 different identities existing on the planet. So you need gay men, and you need older women who've never had kids, and a whole bunch of things. And I remember reading that and thinking, what a delightful concept. I wonder if that's true, because if you think about it, every culture has gay people in it, has other people who don't conform to the the narrow ideas about what's necessary. I mean, if you could prove that you did need 7 or 10 or 15 different kinds of people for people to be able to reproduce, that would be so liberating in a lot of ways.
It might also cut down the birth rate, which is pushing our planet to extinction. So maybe that would be great, right? From now on, you have to have 10 people. Like, wow, that could get really interesting.
And
Yes.
I think I want to say how appreciative I have been for the reception that I got from the Senior Center and from you and Reed to get to where we are today. A year and a half or so ago, I wasn't feeling like I belonged to the Senior Center. But after I was able to explain where I was coming from, and you all embraced that as a welcome, I felt very differently about the Senior Center. So thank you for that.
Oh, Don, thank you for that. That's really hugely important. And that's part of, we created the Queer Elder Family Group, I think in 2020, because we had done a program, which actually Don asked for, about a photography exhibit in New York that was called the Lost Closet Years, like what it cost people to not be able to come out, to not be able to be honest about who they are in the world. And that program, which you can go look at, it's on our website and it's fantastic. And it was so moving and so powerful. And it was so clear that we really needed to create a space, a safe, comfortable, fun space for people to hang out together and feel accepted, welcome, and encouraged. And this is what came out of that. And I think it's only part of what came out of that, but it's one of the treasures that came out of that. And another piece that came out is that we're doing lots of other projects and things. Rick is part of the When Life Changes program, talking about how to handle all the things that can happen in your life that kind of are surprising. Suddenly you're a widow, suddenly you're alone, suddenly you have a debilitating illness or whatever. Those things are tough to negotiate, but there are those among us who can help create new understandings and ways to hold those things in our lives more comfortably and safely. There are those among us who are doing these recordings and capturing stories, and there are those among us who just have a really good time at potlucks and are great cooks. We have musicians and actors and speakers and thought leaders of all kinds. And we have just fabulous, genuine, interesting, wonderful, warm people. And I think that's something I would like everyone to come away with. Is like, when we have a queer elder potluck, you're all invited, everybody. It's a family group. Every age, every identification is welcome. And the more that we get to know each other as people, the less we are those labels, the less we are the alphabet soup, and the more we are just who we are. And that piece, I think, is really enriching for everybody. So I was going to start saying, like, I'll tell Reed when we're going to have a potluck and he can put it in those Monday emails, and everybody's welcome as long as you bring something really delicious. Right? Eve, do you want to finish us off?
Did you say meat? Am I still muted? No. I think that I'm just gonna go back to what I was saying before, that things are a progress. I think that the Queer Elders Family Group here is a progress. I think that transfriending is so much a progress, and Bainbridge Pride is a progress. Rainbow Crew Northwest has only been around since the beginning of the pandemic. All these things are things that didn't really exist here just 8 years ago. And things change all the time. It used to be Gay Liberation, then it was Gay Liberation Front, then it became Gay Liberation, and then eventually it turned into LGB. And it took years, it took decades to add T to that. But once T was added, then the floodgates kind of opened. But even then it took a little while, because people say, well, wait a second, I don't quite feel there. I don't quite feel there. And I meant immediately just interest, that, meant intersex, but, some people just thought it meant interested. Q is questioning as well as queer. And could we use the word queer? Well, let's say that it could also mean questioning. So all these things that happen in this alphabet that at some point will be as long as the regular alphabet. And at some point we'll have as many definitions in it, because A is just like the frightening one. It's A this, A that, A gender. And who knew that there were agender people? But I know trans people who, what I would consider trans people who call themselves agender. I know trans people who I don't think follow the rules. Like if you're, a trans woman like myself, you shouldn't be confused by somebody who looks like you, except that they have a hipster beard. While they're wearing an evening gown. I keep saying, no, that's wrong. That's just wrong. But, that's my confusion, and I don't need to go up and tell that person that they're wrong. I just say, well, that doesn't work for me. That would never have worked for me.
But I think that richness is part of the new treasure to me.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. It's like seeing somebody with a purple beard and a fabulous gown, but I think that's just awesome. Sheila, you got
it is, and I've gotten used to it. And I said a lot. Anything that they're, I'm thinking about this person. Boy, people could be thinking that about me. So I'm, try to have, some grace, some gratitude, some generosity. It's sometimes a challenge, and the thing is that we should admit that, yeah, sometimes things are a challenge.
Right. It's true.
And it's a lot easier than you think in a lot of ways. And at the same time, it's like, oh, I want the days when there were rules. I want the days where you just knew what was what. But that's just being gray. That's just or not.
Being human is just very complicated.
Yeah, being human is gray matter. It's just gray matter. Everything is gray matter.
Let's let Sheila have her question here.
Yeah, I have a question, or just a response, really, more than anything else. So I understand about the diversity, and I certainly understand about the spectrum, my concept. I understand. Why isn't H for heterosexual part of the alphabet soup? Literally, all the letters. Why isn't H in there as well?
Because it's not queer.
Says who?
Well, it says the queer community, right? If you're
those are specific just to the queer community.
Well, here's the thing, Sheila. If you are part of a minority, you're used to being left out of everything. And I think one of the pieces that has been very important is for queer people to kind of stake a place and say, this is our experience, this is our understanding, this is our reality. And that straight people don't always fit because they don't always respect the otherness of that. And so I think there's been no particular interest in making a more inclusive, you could just say the human umbrella involves everybody, but the queer umbrella involves a lot of people who are not necessarily heterosexual, which is still considered the norm pretty much everywhere in the world. So that piece, it's sort of like saying, well, Black Lives Matter, why don't we say White Lives Matter? If you're trying to call out something that has been ignored or denied, you don't necessarily say, oh, and you guys too, right?
There's no laws being passed right now to limit teaching heterosexual white history. But also it would just get more confusing if you put in heterosexual in there. And people think, so H means both homosexual and gay? What's the difference? It would get, but what Anne said is true. This is, there's a lot of people in this alphabet who are in fact heterosexual. allies can be heterosexual. You can be agender and be heterosexual by everybody else's definition. You can be questioning and be heterosexual. You can be queer. You can call yourself queer just because you identify with the queer community. Whether or not you have ever had same sex, whatever that means, relations. Because as we know now, what that I got one, it gets very confusing really quickly. If somebody's non-binary, how can they also be gay? You can't do it, because the word gay doesn't mean anything, but by some views you are, by some view, if I'm with either gender in a relationship, it is either definitely, gay or queer or definitely not, depending on what your perspective is. So how you define heterosexuality gets to be a problem too, but mostly I would say allies, advocates, supporters and such are included in this. And when we have events, they feel part of the community. And other thing is, as I said before, all the letters are getting unwieldy and sometimes uncomfortable. And, it's for that reason that I, at least, generally, often will say to the queer and trans community, and say queer and trans because that both, has identity and, sexuality included in it. And for the most part, I'm seeing the LGBT, outside of in written form, I'm seeing the LGBTQ, IA plus less and less, because people have gotten upset with, well, LGBTQ plus should be good enough. Everything's included in the plus, and then no, LGBTQIA plus. Then now I sound like I'm trying to be really careful, and and at some point, one doesn't want to have to be so careful.
About the U for unique.
Part of it is
Because the more, the more we try to describe ourselves, we recognize that we're all on a unique place in the spectrum, and that you really, I like what
And
you
here
said.
we are. Excuse me. Here we are, Reed. You just added another letter for me. Thank you very much.
That book that
You're
ended,
absolutely right. Reed, you're absolutely right. And I think anybody who describes themselves as unique is queer. Because that's
and
what
Maybe
the
a little
word
bit,
queer
and
really
maybe a
means.
little bit dumpsy and divey.
Yeah.
Just to do the Maresy Dotes, Dozy Dotes thing to close this out. I want to really thank you, Anne, for gathering us together today to have this conversation. It's been enriching to me in many ways, and I hope for all of you.
I hope so too, because it's important that all of us are queer friendly and get used to it. As my friend Steve always says, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. And that's just important. It's just part of who we all are as human beings. And, we need to get used to it. So yeah, you can be a queer ally, you can be queer friendly, you can be queer interested, queer curious, like my cat. But I just want you to be together. I just want you to be open to each other and open to our own experiences. And that is just such a great gift. So thank you, Reed, for having us be part of the community of the Senior Center. It's a great gift for us all.